This video is sponsored by Boo, a social app where you can make friends and date by personality. If you want to interact smoothly and charmingly with people, you can get some in-depth, wingman-esque flirting tips and insightful personality analysis using the telepathy feature. And if you want Reddit, except purely focused on personality types, you can enjoy the social feed. On Boo, you needn't be limited by borders or languages. The alternate dimensions feature allows you to communicate and meet different personality types in different countries and different languages. Sign up using the link below in the description of the video. Productivity, the holy grail of modern life that promises to liberate us from the ceaseless distractions in favor of actually getting the important things done. A recurring theme when it comes to this type-specific advice is that each of them will need to make a particular sacrifice at some point to enable their strengths and powers, for them to flourish and push them forward. It's always a dance between these two pillars of weakness mitigation and strength enabling, both of which, as you might imagine, go hand in hand. ESTPs and ESFPs. The first part is the worst part, and that's planning things out. Neither of these types can exist too long in the planning phase, otherwise they'll drive themselves, and then possibly other people around them, nuts. But it's essential. Any fundamentally improvisational, adaptable, and spontaneous type, as ESTPs and ESFPs are, must find a way to exist within some kind of overarching structure. Otherwise they are kites in a hurricane, forces of nature who just do stuff on sheer impulse, without direction or vision. So they need to grin and bear the planning stage, to map things out, to create metrics to measure success, set reminders, and prompts to guide them. Then, crucially, forget the plan completely and take things one day at a time. ESFPs have extroverted thinking as a very valued function, so they will be quite adept at channeling that organizational, systematic, and structured way of thinking. ESTPs don't particularly struggle with these things either. Introverted thinking can actually achieve the same results, where it helps them break down long-term goals into manageable, logical chunks. So ESFPs will be using their TE and NI in combination, and ESTPs will be using their TI and NI in combination during this initial planning stage. Once that overall route is decided, they no longer have to worry about the introverted intuition planning stuff. It's done. Pick a direction, point yourself towards it, then go. INTPs and ISTPs. Both of these types are pretty chilled out and laid back for the most part. ISTPs are going to be significantly more able than INTPs at jumping into things, rolling with the chaos, and taking swift action. Generally though, both of these types enjoy working independently, in their own time, on their own schedule, and in their own way. Like many high TI users, they like to work things out for themselves. They might, and by definition often will, come to the same conclusions and results as other TI users, but they need to analyze it in their own way first. TI is both individual and universal in that sense. This brings up many issues when it comes to productivity in modern life. Especially certain workplaces, there's often a presumption of needing to be a good team player, or to work in groups, or just embrace the social side of things at your job. This isn't to say that these types aren't social, they certainly can be, but the idea of them having a preference for group work as their default seems very unlikely to me. So a simple way for them to increase their productivity is to make sure that they always have that independent working time. Yes, like everyone, they can be distractible and procrastinate when left to their own devices, both figuratively and literally, but over time, independent working is going to serve them much better. For ISTPs, it's always important for them to retain that flexibility in life. So taking on projects that might restrict and box them in, even if that is just a perception in their own mind, will definitely decrease the odds of them being productive long term. INTPs can leverage the power of habit to achieve consistent productivity. INTJs and INFJS. Both of these types, by virtue of being NI DOMs, are considered to be long-range thinkers and planners. But this in itself isn't a guarantee of productivity. INTJs generally will have less issues in this area than INFJs because of their powerful TE. but they do still both encounter archetypically similar issues. The first relates to perfectionism, or perhaps not quite that, but rather an allegiance to the way they have envisioned something. Because both of these types like to think through all the way to the end of a plan, whenever possible, each step in their plan is cohesive, which is clever and efficient. However, it can also mean that one part of their plan going wrong throws the rest of it off. Usually they rectify this by contingency planning, i.e., making a backup plan to the original plan. But that's still quite rigid in nature, as opposed to building flexibility into their plans, or being highly changeable and adaptable when needed. So this rigid and control-based nature that they have is a double-edged sword. Plans in practice require lots of compromise and settling. The second issue relates to taking action. Since it is a strength, they spend far too long in the planning and envisioning stage. Sometimes it's better to take the plunge and burn your boats by jumping into something without a safety net, forcing yourself to power through by adapting and acting instead of thinking. So their issues ultimately come down to putting perfect plans for getting things done ahead of actually doing them. ENFJs and ESFJs. These two types have a lot going for them when it comes to getting things done in life. They are high energy, don't struggle with working with people, and have plenty of creativity when it comes to problem solving. There are some things that can catch them out though. I think both of these types can end up falling into a lifestyle that robs them of time and energy by taking on and getting involved in too much stuff, particularly when it comes to helping other people at their own expense. They can find themselves spread way too thin because of interpersonal commitments and, at least in their mind, obligations to others that they need to follow through on. So it's important for these types to have that alone time carved out for themselves, where they are simply focusing on the things that they need to get done, without any of those distractions. The flip side of this coin would be them leveraging their social networks. Any relationship could, in theory, be collaborative in some way. It doesn't have to be purely social. Relationships can be multi-purpose, where work and play are well integrated. So don't fall into the trap of each interaction being at odds with your productivity, where it's robbing you of both time and energy. ENTPs and ENFPs. Many of you will be aware of the Pareto principle, which broadly states that much of our success comes from a comparatively small amount of our effort. Specifically that 80% of the output comes from 20% of the input over time. ENTPs and ENFPs exemplify this idea in their working style. The slow, diligent grind, grounded in a foundation of brutally relentless and unwavering dedication, consistency, and the beating up against the brick wall of mundanity with one's head, is not exactly their style. They like to play, to experiment, to have their ideational fun, and that is precisely what they should do. There are still a few things to bear in mind whilst doing this though. That highly variable energy, when it comes to work, needs to be controlled to the extent that it can be. The highs are actually more dangerous than the lows, because those are the times where these types will take on too much, and start too many projects, and say yes too often. Then, during the lower energy moments, they will feel disillusioned, overwhelmed, or just bored and uninspired. So the most obvious way to be productive for ENTPs and ENFPs is to level off the highs to decrease the impact of the lows, or in simple terms, to not take too much on. However, despite this, another alternative or perhaps complementary approach is simply to understand that experimentation and discovery necessitate failure. So a project or plan that leads to nothing hasn't necessarily led to nothing. There's inherent value in it that might not always be tangible, in the same way that experience affords knowledge that's just in your bones somehow, if not always on the tip of your tongue. So what I'd also recommend is reframing what productivity actually means for ENFPs and ENTPs, because it might be something quite different to them compared with most people and most types. NE prizes these conceptual expeditions at the expense of something concrete and precise. It's important to make sure things don't get totally out of control, but also to embrace it. ISTJs and ISFJs. Productivity is not something that either of these types struggle with that much, but there are still particular approaches that work better for them, and some blind spots that are good to be aware of. Productivity for these two types comes down to habit mainly. It's about integrating certain practices and routines into their daily life, which over time compound and become even more powerful and effective. Since they know they are capable of immense consistency and longevity in doing so, they can afford to do little amounts every day, and because of the nature of habit, it becomes easier and easier over time. So given enough time to craft these systems in their life, things will become almost automated. And since that foundational baseline layer of their life can be run on autopilot, it means that they are freed up to add even more to it. Their biggest blind spot comes from this exact tendency though, i.e. being too much a creature of habit. Whilst moving along swimmingly with their tried and tested approaches, they might be leaving orders of magnitude of productivity increases on the table. Simply branching out a little bit, innovating, or experimenting with a new approach could revolutionize their lives. And because of their habitual nature, they might never discover it. So it's good to be aware of this and account for it. ENTJs and ESTJs. You could make the case that these two types are the most productive. However, there are two things that can cause the same issue for these types. The first is that precisely because they are so good at getting things done, sometimes this can bring redundancy into their life because they're constantly doing stuff, because they know they can. And just because they know they can, doesn't mean they should. They want to be doing things all the time, which means they might not always stop to wonder if they need to slow down a bit, or focus more on something specific. The second issue is their inferior FI, and how it's dominated by their TE. One thing that low FI users can struggle with is priorities. Not in the sense of what order things should be done in to achieve the most efficient results, but what things you should be focusing on in life generally. For example, an ENTJ or ESTJ might perfectly nail some career path and rise to the top of an area, only to realize that they actually hate the job and don't want to be there anymore, because they were focused on the TE priorities and not the FI. ENTJs are going to make better long-term planners, but ESTJs are going to be exceptionally effective at getting the day-to-day stuff nailed, which can sometimes be even more important. So ENTJs and ESTJs need to focus on both kinds of life priorities. Otherwise, their productivity in the short term will actually be undermined long term because they're working on things that they won't end up caring about. INFPs and ISFPs. For INFPs and ISFPs, they need to have some kind of resonance with what they're doing, especially if it's a longer term goal. Their FI somewhat dominates their TE. So their desire to organize, structure, and regiment themselves is always going to be dependent on them being invested in what they're doing. They need to believe in it, to be in alignment with it, to feel like their values and principles hang above a given task, like a North Star to orient and guide them. Most of the time, we have to deal with day-to-day stuff though. It's hard to align your values with needing to do grocery shopping or paperwork. But if these two types feel like they're living life on their own terms, regardless of what form that takes, everything is going to have more of a flow to it, an ease, where things don't feel like effort in the same way as they do when it's in service of some goal or job or life path they hate. So that's when it comes to longer term stuff, such as their career or direction in life in general. ISFPs are going to be able to jump into things more easily and get things done amongst the chaos. Their powerful SE and NI helps them adapt and plan excellently. With INFPs, they're going to struggle to get started at times and might drift into inertia. But once they get going, they'll be able to channel that consistency, habit, and follow through when needed with their SI, whilst solving problems creatively with their NE. So they both have advantages, but ultimately it's about reconciling and aligning their dominant FI and inferior TE.